Hi, I'm Grant Strem from Proton Technologies, and I'm here to talk about carbon capture as it relates to clear hydrogen. So there's typical ways to think about carbon capture, and that's usually storing it in a deep saline aquifer as uh, a mobile form. In our case, we turn it to carbonate rock. So that's a little bit different. So I'm going to be educating about that. Trying to advance the slides. Now we've got an interesting team. We've been around for a few years. And this diagram really sort of gives the basic concept of what we're trying to achieve. So on a net flow basis, we take the oxygen from the air, CO2 that we might separate from our produced gas stream, and CO2 that we might take from third-party sources or direct air capture, and we pull it down with the oxygen. And the way we do that is actually doesn't need extra compression for the CO2. We can just use the Venturi effect to suck it in. So um, think of an oil reservoir as a bucket of beach sand. And if you are trying to drain oil out of it, all of that oil between the grains, you can't get it all to mobilize perfectly to a production wellbore. So that leaves behind an enormous fuel deposit behind. And our goal is to take hydrocarbons and leave behind carbonate in the pore space. So it's kind of a transformation, and it's a transformation that's very hydrogen productive and energy productive, as you can imagine. So um, when the oxygen goes in, it reacts with these remnant hydrocarbons and produces higher temperature reactions that liberate CO2 as part of the reaction, in addition to the CO2 that goes down with the oxygen. And all of this CO2, though, the goal is to leave it crystallized in the pore space of the rock. So I'm going to make um, the Grant window a little bit larger for a moment. I'm going to hold up a rock. So this is not a sedimentary rock. It's actually an igneous rock from Iceland. But I thought it was interesting because it shows a lot of pores, and some of the pores are filled in with solids. So it wasn't like those were there when the rock was formed. It was just that fluids migrated through, and the chemical conditions were sufficient to crystallize solids within the pore space or the bugs within this rock. So similarly, we're trying to do the same general concept within the pore space of sandstone or a carbonate reservoir, or more of any hydrocarbon reservoir, really. So that's the goal. And let me elaborate a little bit further. Let me shrink my personal view there a bit and advance the slide. So we needed to buy an oil field, so we did buy an oil field. And we've actually been sequestering carbon in our oil field since 2020, I think the Q2 2020. And how are we doing this? So in many sedimentary formations, it takes a long time. In oil and gas deposits, it often takes a long time for carbonate to form from CO2. It does happen through geologic time as enough chemicals move through the system. But if the goal is to monitor stuff for 1,000 years or worry about, what are the neighbors going to say, then leaving it in a mobile form, yeah, I guess it's possible. The geological seal's proven itself for a long time and held in natural gas and things like that. So I actually don't have any discomfort from that. And we have a deep saline aquifer below our project as well. But within our project, we turned on a steam generator in 2020, and the pH of the fluid going in so that it doesn't scale off inside the steam generator is roughly, it's like above 12, pH of 12, which means an enormous load of hydroxide ions, which we're blasting down with the steam directly into the oil field. So most of the time, when companies do steam recovery projects, and by that I mean oil recovery projects using steam, they split out the vapor phase from the condensed water phase, and then the condensed water phase is separately handled at surface and dealt with, usually chemically. And then the only the vapor phase goes down. But for us, part of our patents is that, when you do the reaction that makes the carbonate in the pore space, you actually end up releasing additional hydrogen within your reservoir. And that additional hydrogen is, of economic value, and it's getting popular lately. So this is kind of the way we've been focused on it, and we've been doing it. Um, this is probably a good time to talk about why are we doing all this. So, is there a technical reason that we capture all the CO2? Not, no, there isn't. So, but governments around the world have all agreed that we should emit less CO2 into our atmosphere. And carbon taxes are ensuring that it's very painful for us to make these emissions. So, if there's ways to avoid that, we should. In Alberta, for example, for those from an international audience, Alberta is in Canada inland, and it has very large oil and gas deposits and a lot of places to sequester CO2. The carbon tax in Canada is going up to $180 per ton. Maybe it's 170, something pretty high. I think it was 170 per ton by 2030, and it's partway into 2023. That's just around the corner, and it's already about $65 a ton. But by 2030, the emissions in Alberta mean a $44 billion drag on the economy from carbon taxes alone. And so if you sort of divide that by the rest of the economy and what's going on, that's a major thing. If you look at like a healthcare budget, like Alberta could have a space program for that $44 billion instead, with a bigger budget than NASA or whatever your hobby project is. Maybe it's arts, maybe it's some other thing. There are many other things we could spend that money on. So if we can make the same amount of energy or more at lower cost, just by not having CO2 emissions, or better yet, getting paid for the excess CO2 that we inject and turn to stone, then that's a massive economic opportunity. So for those who want to have, I guess the other aspect of carbon intensity is if you can get carbon negative, like a carbon intensity by life cycle analysis of minus 20, 30, 40, then that's tremendous. So our goal is to always have a carbon intensity of at least -1 by life cycle analysis when we're building a project. And I mean, not our demo site yet, but we intend to do it there as well. So if you have a carbon intensity on the hydrogen you produce from an oil field, or let's say you're sequestering more molecules of carbon dioxide than you're producing in terms of scope 3 emissions, you can actually have carbon negative oil as a product. So that requires probably a meaningful amount of direct air capture or close proximity to a carbon trunk line or something like that. But yeah, without additional compression, we think we can pull in low pressure CO2 into high pressure oxygen using the Venturi effect at a 2-to-1 ratio of CO2 to oxygen. Ultimately, this ends up with something like a carbon intensity in the range of -20, -25, -30, somewhere in that neighborhood, depending on the pressure of the reservoir and some other factors, available heat. So at surface, like hydrogen turbine exhaust, for example. But anyway, getting to extremely low carbon intensity by life cycle analysis is fairly straightforward. I'll elaborate a little bit on how to get very, very close to zero. Getting below zero, like I mentioned, requires new sources of CO2 coming to the site. So like green, which by life cycle intensity, carbon intensity, there's going to be, it's non-zero for the cement, the steel, the decommissioning. Ours, if we weren't only capturing our own CO2, would still be more than zero for the same reasons. So, but since we have this massive way to store huge volumes as rock, we can get deeply below zero by life cycle intensity. And then, yeah, we don't have to go through expensive, complicated ways to try and capture its surface. The other, I guess, a benefit of this overall process, so I mentioned when you form carbonate in the subsurface, it releases additional hydrogen. that really drops the cost of your hydrogen. So you're getting paid in a couple of ways. One of them is to turn CO2 to stone, and the other is through the hydrogen that it generates as a result. So if the concept is storing hydrogen alone, of course, you're only maybe being paid to store it or avoiding the carbon tax that you would otherwise pay. Whereas if you have a sort of you can think about it like a CO2 to hydrogen project. So ignoring all that, it's a very low cost method for making hydrogen because I won't dwell on this too long because it's a sequestration thing, but if you're buying natural gas, it's hard to avoid all carbon intensity. There's upstream fugitive emissions and so forth. Um, with green hydrogen, it's also, well, it's expensive to constantly be buying fuel. If you're using that unswept oil that's in the pore space between sand grains and it's non-producible, non-economic, oxygen can still find that to react with, and it becomes a fuel source for triggering reactions that make more hydrogen alongside of opening up pore space that can be backfilled with carbonate. And I guess it's worth making the point that if you're doing this within the reservoir, this will happen preferentially in the high perm streaks. Well, mostly in the bottom water, but if it is up in the oil zone, it's like a polymer flood blocking off the perm channel so you get better sweep efficiency out of the rest. This slide, I'll ignore core markets. There isn't really core markets. The whole world is now trying to decarbonize. So perhaps this is an old slide. But the point is that we are not volume limited for how we can store CO2. And if you store it as a solid, it's about 12 times smaller in volume than if you store it as liquid or supercritical fluid. So, whatever pore space you were looking at for carbon, if you crystallize it as carbonate in that same system, you can put a lot more CO2 into it. This gives a better diagram. So cryogenic distillation of air, which means cooling the air until the oxygen's a liquid and the nitrogen is still a gas. You now have two fairly pure streams. So with the pure liquid oxygen, how do you get that down in the reservoir? And so the easiest way is to warm it up. So heat exchanging with the produced gases. For example, if we assume that we're injecting that oxygen into a high pH plume area, any carbonic acid that forms down there or that we put down there is going to be crystallizing as carbonate. But some of it will still come up with hydrogen and methane and a couple other things. And if we're heat exchanging with that oxygen to warm it up, we can heat exchange that first with the gases that come out of the well. So CO2 liquefies around, well, it depends on the pressure, but let's say you can freeze it in minus 75 or something like that. And if you're under pressure, 5 or 8 bars of pressure, you can end up liquefying it at, fairly straightforward temperatures. So you get food grade CO2. Maybe some of it you can sell by truck or have another use for, like urea or methanol production. But whatever you can't sell, you just suck into the high pressured oxygen stream. So you can also distill out the rest of the products through heat exchange, leaving you with cold hydrogen that you can chill further to liquefy, or use it in combination with hot turbine exhaust and nitrogen to make ammonia. So ammonia is a pretty easy vector for us as well. Yeah, some cost structure advantages because we're using the oxygen, we're using the nitrogen, noble gases if it's a big project. Anyways, many revenue streams. One of the significant ones is permanent storage of the CO2. So how do we know it's permanent and what defines that? Well, we have very good measurements of what goes down and very good measurements of what comes up. And we also know the pore space of the open gas space. That's like a third party reserves report can tell you what is the pore space probably. And then you look at the gas composition in that pore space, and you know that anything that's not in there is highly likely permanently stored, and the majority of it will be mineralized as CO2. That can be confirmed through 3D seismic because the carbonate increases the acoustic velocity of the rock. So, it shows up on seismic basically. And then if you want to, you can even core it and verify it. And look at the carbonate like they do at CarbFix in Iceland, and where there's all these pictures of smiling Icelandic people with sequestered um, CO2 as carbonate. Um, some oil fields are more easy to do that in, again, but a lot of them are not. So this ensures, the high pH plume ensures that with all that hydroxide and carbonic acid, there's going to be reactions. And if it's calcium hydroxide, then calcium carbonate's the most easy out of about 80 carbonates that can be formed. I'm maybe getting too long-winded, so I'll try and accelerate. At our site in Saskatchewan, after we added the steam generator in 2020, we have been sequestering CO2, and we intend to upsize that, and we'd like to do it. We have 2 injection pads, and one of them we're going to go total crazy with hydroxide injection coming up, hopefully late this year. The one that's unsteamed. So if we get a 3D seismic survey of the whole thing, we should be able to see what we've already done and maybe a core well, and then have a virgin area of the reservoir that we hopefully within a fairly short span of time can sequester huge amounts of CO2 as carbonate. So most oil and gas areas still have lots of legacy oil fields and energy infrastructure that can be repurposed towards carbon sequestration as carbonate, but also there's usually power lines at the same site. So if you collect hydrogen, burn it in a turbine and make electricity, or like I said, put it together with nitrogen and make ammonia. There are a lot of different uses for the hydrogen, and there are some uses for the CO2 as well, in terms of, well, if it's food grade CO2, you can use it for many different things. Yeah, decarbonizing is easier done if you do it at the source. So if you're trying to capture, tailpipe emissions from cars, that's really tricky and cumbersome. If you're trying to capture tailpipe emissions from houses, that's possible. You can do, pyrolysis or something if you're in a cold country. There are ways that you can do these things, but I think the simplest is just send hydrogen down the lines for everything or most things. And we can do that because we can make hydrogen cheaper than natural gas at carbon intensity lower than 0, which means the more hydrogen we make and consume, the less CO2 would otherwise be in the atmosphere. So a carbon intensity lower than 0 on products is like a pretty critical thing to think about in terms of importance of demarcation. So if you have one project that's like carbon intensity is minus 30 and you're doing a lot of it, a gigawatt of power at strongly carbon negative intensity, that can offset an entire enormous system of emissions quite readily, for example. And I'm sure many of you watching this are able to calculate that. If you look at some of my old LinkedIn posts, I've done that for you. Yeah, we do have cell licenses. We've got licensees in 16 countries for the hydrogen, and they also get the benefit of carbon sequestration because that's part of the hydrogen. Great team. I'm really delighted that so many great people have joined us. We've got a couple who are not on here. One of the changes is Rob Otway has joined our board, and on the advisory board, we now additionally have Ron Davison and Mike McFadden, who was the president of Murphy Canada previously. Yeah, this is a very enormously scalable process for storing CO2 within zones that already have wells in them and repurposing all that infrastructure in a way that makes it additional revenue streams. And I think that this is going to be probably, the dominant path for sequestration in the future. And it fits very well into, existing industry and ecosystem of infrastructure. I guess that's a big part of it. One of the large ways to make hydrogen is to make carbonate in the pore space at the bottom water primarily. And it's been done before. So I think I'll probably end my presentation there if I can figure out how. Oh, let's see, should be a stop recording button. There we go.